The laptop screen was still glowing when I walked back into the kitchen, and for 3 full seconds, I thought I was looking at someone else's life. My name is Natalie Whitfield. I'm 32 years old, and I've spent most of those years as the person my family calls when something needs to be carried, fixed, watched, or fixed again, usually for free, always without being asked twice. The email on the screen wasn't addressed to me. It was between my mother, Carol, and my sister, Brooke, and it had been sitting open on my mother's laptop because she'd forgotten to log out after using my kitchen table to plan a trip I hadn't been told about. I wasn't snooping. I was getting a glass of water. But my eyes caught my own name in the subject line, and after that, there was no version of that evening where I didn't read every word. She won't mind watching the kids again, my mother had written. She doesn't really have anything going on. It's free help, and it keeps her useful. I read it twice. Then a third time, to make sure I hadn't misunderstood the tone of a sentence that seemed, on its surface, almost administrative, the kind of line you'd write about a rental car, not a daughter. I want to tell you I felt rage first. I didn't. I felt something quieter and colder, like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left without moving at all. 32 years. A lifetime of birthdays remembered a day late, holidays where I did the dishes while everyone else took photos, a family group chat where my updates got a thumbs up emoji and Brooks got paragraphs. I had built a whole personality around being useful because usefulness, I'd learned early, was the only currency that ever got me a seat at the table. I didn't know yet, standing in that kitchen with cold water sweating down the side of a glass I'd forgotten I was holding, that this email was going to be the smallest piece of what I'd eventually find. I didn't know that in 6 weeks, I'd be standing in a gallery in front of 30 strangers, watching my mother's face change in real time as she understood, for the first time in her life, that I had stopped being invisible. I just knew, in that moment, that something in me had quietly, finally, stopped agreeing to disappear. I should tell you who I was before that email, because the woman standing in that kitchen didn't come out of nowhere. I grew up the second of 2 daughters in a house in Springfield, Ohio, where my sister Brooke was, by some unspoken family law, the daughter things were supposed to go well for. She was older by 3 years, prettier in the specific way my mother valued, and effortlessly good at being adored. I was the other one, competent, quiet, useful. When Brooke forgot her lines in the school play, my mother laughed about it for years as an endearing story. When I got the highest GPA in my graduating class, my father asked if the ceremony would run long because he had a tea time. I don't say this to make you feel sorry for a childhood that, on paper, had no obvious cruelty in it. No one hit me. No one screamed. It was quieter than that, and quiet things are harder to point to, harder to name, harder to convince yourself are real instead of oversensitivity. By the time I was 32, I had 2 jobs, technically, one that paid my mortgage, and one I'd never told my family about at all. The first was accounting, part-time, for a mid-sized firm downtown, work I was good at and felt almost nothing about. The second was photography, real photography, the kind I'd been quietly building for 3 years in the corners of my life my family never asked about, because they'd never asked what I did with my time when I wasn't available to them. I had 15 exhibition quality pieces by that spring. I had a small but growing relationship with a gallery owner named Nathan Cole, who'd taken a chance on 3 of my prints the previous fall and watched them sell for a combined $8,400, more money than I made in 2 months at the accounting firm, and more validation than I'd received from my family in 3 decades combined. I hadn't told them. Not because I was ashamed. Because some part of me, the part that had learned young to keep the good things quiet, suspected that the moment my family found out I had something they hadn't approved, they would find a way to make it smaller. I was right, eventually. Just not in the way I expected. 2 weeks before I found that email, my mother called to ask if I could watch Brooke's kids for the weekend, Tyler, 5, Ava, 3, and baby Grace, only 6 weeks old at the time, while she and my father helped Brooke get some rest. I said yes. I always said yes. Saying yes had become so automatic that I sometimes agreed to things before I'd fully processed what I was agreeing to, the way you nod along to a song you don't actually know the words to. That weekend blurs together in my memory now: feeding schedules, a diaper bag that always seemed to be missing exactly the thing I needed, Tyler asking me 400 times when his mom was coming back, Ava falling asleep on my chest at 11 at night while I sat frozen so I wouldn't wake her. I loved those kids. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came later never touched the way I felt about Tyler and Ava and baby Grace. My anger was never about them. What I noticed, though, and dismissed, the way you dismiss a smell you can't quite place, was the way my mother thanked me when she picked the kids up Sunday evening. "You're a lifesaver," she said, already halfway to her car, keys in hand. "Seriously, I don't know what we'd do without you." It should have felt good. It didn't, entirely, and I couldn't name why until much later. There was something in the phrasing, "what we'd do without you," that treated me less like a sister and more like a service that happened to be free. I told myself I was being oversensitive. I had a habit of doing that, running my own reactions through a filter that always defaulted to your overreacting before it let me feel anything else. It was a habit I'd built at 13 and never fully outgrown. The following week, at a family dinner for my father's 65th birthday, I noticed something else, small, easy to miss, the kind of detail that only means something once you already know what to look for. My mother had brought a stack of photographs to pass around the table, vacation pictures from a trip to Charleston the previous year. I flipped through them along with everyone else, smiling at the familiar faces, until I realized I wasn't in a single one. "Wait," I said, mostly to myself, "was I not on this trip?" My mother didn't look up from refilling wine glasses. "You had work, sweetheart. Remember? The tax season thing." I didn't remember, actually. Tax season had ended in April, and the Charleston trip, according to the timestamp on one of the photos, had been in June. But I let it go, because the alternative was making a scene at my father's birthday dinner over a detail that felt, in the moment, too small to be worth the discomfort of pursuing it. That's a red flag I can name now, clearly, with the benefit of everything I know since. I dismissed it because confronting it would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit, that I had somehow been left off a family trip and no one had thought it worth mentioning to me at the time, let alone apologizing for it after. I filed it away instead. I was becoming very good, that spring, at filing things away. If you've ever smiled and nodded while something inside you was already gone, you know exactly what that dinner felt like. Brooke cornered me in the kitchen later that evening while I was loading the dishwasher, a task that had become mine by some unspoken assignment no one had ever actually made out loud. "So, exciting news," she said, leaning against the counter with the particular brightness she reserved for moments she wanted something. "We're doing a big Hawaii trip in August. Mom and Dad, us, the kids, the whole thing. 10 days. "That sounds amazing," I said, and I meant it, genuinely happy for a moment before some instinct made me ask the obvious question. "Should I look at flights too?" Brooke's expression did something small and quick, a flicker I would have missed if I hadn't already been primed, that week, to notice small flickers. "Oh, I mean, it's kind of already booked. It's a lot of people already. Maybe next time?" "Next time," I repeated. "Don't make it weird," she said, laughing lightly, already turning to grab her purse. "It's just logistics. You know how it is." I did the dishes. I said goodnight to everyone. I drove home with my hands tied on the steering wheel and a feeling in my chest I couldn't yet name, something between humiliation and the particular ache of being told, politely, that you weren't logistically worth including. I didn't know yet that already booked was a lie, or that the real reason had been decided weeks earlier, in writing, by two people who assumed I would never see it. The unease didn't leave after that dinner. It followed me into the following weeks the way a low-grade fever follows you through your day, present in everything, explaining nothing on its own. I started noticing things I'd apparently trained myself not to notice for years. The way my mother's texts to Brooke, visible sometimes on a shared family calendar app, were warmer, longer, full of exclamation points I never received. The way my father asked about Brooke's promotion 3 separate times over dinner but never once asked how my photography, which he did, technically, know about by then, in the vaguest possible terms, was going. The way I was always the name attached to logistics, and Brooke was always the name attached to celebration. I told Nathan, my gallery contact, some of this over coffee one afternoon, not expecting him to have much to say about a family dynamic he'd never witnessed firsthand. "You know what's strange," he said, turning his cup slowly on the table, "is that you talk about your work like it's something you're allowed to have as long as no one important finds out. That's not how people who are actually supported talk about the things they've built." I didn't have a response to that. I sat with it the rest of the day, the way you sit with something true that you're not ready to fully unpack. Sleep started slipping around then, in small ways I didn't connect to anything specific at first, lying awake an extra 20 minutes, waking at 4 instead of 6, my mind circling the same handful of moments without landing anywhere useful. I told myself it was work stress. Tax season had ended, but a mid-year audit had come up at the firm, and it was reasonable, I thought, to blame my exhaustion on spreadsheets instead of on the specific ache of being told, politely, that I didn't fit into a family vacation. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever spent years being the reliable one, the one who shows up, who doesn't complain, who gets thanked with a hurried "you're a lifesaver" instead of actually being asked how she's doing, you know exactly what that particular exhaustion feels like. It doesn't look like burnout from the outside. It just looks like someone who's fine. It never looks like what it actually is. I found out later, much later, from Brooke herself, in a moment of unguarded honesty she probably regretted, what had actually been happening behind the scenes that summer. She told me, months afterward, what had been going through her mind in the weeks leading up to that dinner. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. Mom brought up leaving Natalie off the trip first, not me. I just went along with it because arguing with Mom has never gotten me anywhere good, not once in my whole life. I told myself Natalie wouldn't even want to come, that she'd rather stay home with her camera stuff than sit on a beach with 3 kids under 6. I told myself a lot of things that summer that let me sleep at night. The truth is, it was easier to have her home watching my kids for free than paying for a 4th adult ticket to Hawaii, and I let that math make the decision instead of anything that actually mattered. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, standing in my own kitchen that summer, only that something in my family's math had never once included me as anything other than a convenient variable. The accidental discovery, the one that changed everything, happened on a Tuesday evening in late June, 3 days after that family dinner. My mother had come over to drop off a box of old childhood photographs she'd been meaning to give me for years, and she'd used my kitchen table to finish some emails on her laptop before heading out, the way she often did, treating my apartment as an extension of her own errands. She left in a hurry. Brooke had called about something with the baby, and forgot to close her email before she left. I noticed the laptop still open when I came back into the kitchen for water. I wasn't going to look. I want to be honest about that moment, because it matters. My first instinct was to close the lid and text her that she'd left it open, nothing more. But my own name was sitting right there in an open thread, and some instinct older than my manners made me stop. The thread was between my mother and Brooke, dated 3 weeks earlier, well before that birthday dinner, well before Brooke's already booked excuse. My mother had written, "We should just leave Natalie off the Hawaii trip. She won't mind watching the kids again while we're gone, she doesn't really have anything going on. It's free help, and it keeps her useful. Plus it saves us a ticket." Brooke's reply, sent 40 minutes later, "LOL true. She'll probably be relieved not to have to deal with all of us anyway." I read it 3 times. Then I took a screenshot, because some part of me, the accountant part, the part trained to preserve evidence before it disappears, understood immediately that I would need proof of this later, even before I fully understood what later would look like. I know some of you already see where this is going. I didn't. Not yet. I just knew that something in my chest had gone very still, the the specific stillness of a person standing at the edge of a decision she hasn't made yet but already knows is coming. I closed the laptop. I didn't text her that she'd left it open. That was, I'll admit now, the first small cruelty I allowed myself in this entire story, letting her leave without knowing what I'd seen, letting the imbalance between us tip, for once, in my favor instead of hers. It wasn't dignity. It was strategy, and I knew the difference even as I chose it. The days after finding that email moved differently than the days before it. I moved through my accounting job on autopilot, running numbers I could have run in my sleep, while underneath it, something colder and more deliberate was assembling itself. My profession gave me an advantage my family never accounted for, because they'd never taken it seriously enough to think about it at all. I spent my days finding inconsistencies in ledgers, small numbers that didn't add up, patterns that revealed themselves only when you looked at the full picture instead of one transaction at a time. I applied the same instinct to my own family for the first time in my life, and what I found didn't surprise me so much as it confirmed a shape I'd been avoiding looking at directly for years. I went back through years of family photos, texts, invitations, not obsessively, but methodically, the way I'd audit a client's books. I found the Charleston trip photos again, and this time I checked the dates against my own calendar. I hadn't had a work conflict that weekend at all. I'd simply never been invited, and someone had needed a reason that wasn't the real one. I found 17 family events over 3 years where I'd either been the designated help, watching kids, running errands, hosting when no one else wanted to, or quietly absent from the guest list entirely, with no explanation offered because none had ever been required. I didn't confront anyone yet. I told myself I was gathering context. The truth was closer to something Nathan had said weeks earlier, about how I talked about my work like something I wasn't fully allowed to have. I was starting to understand that my family operated the same way about my worth as a whole. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was simpler and colder than hostility. It was math. I had just never been on the side of the equation that counted. My Aunt Diane, my mother's younger sister, the only person in my extended family who had ever, consistently, asked me real questions about my actual life, called that week to check in, the way she did every couple of months. "You sound different," she said, after I'd answered 3 of her questions in the flat, careful voice I used when I was holding something back. I told her about the email. I hadn't planned to. It came out in pieces, and by the end, my voice wasn't flat anymore. "I'm not surprised," Diane said quietly, after a long pause. "I've watched your mother do this to you your whole life, Nat." I should have said something years ago. I didn't, because it wasn't my family to fix, and I told myself that made it not my responsibility. I was wrong about that. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I asked. "Because your mother has a way of making the person who raises the concern into the problem," Diane said. "I watched it happen to your father's mother once, years ago, over something much smaller than this. I didn't want to become the next person written out of the family for noticing something true. It was the first time anyone in my family had confirmed, out loud, that what I'd spent 32 years quietly absorbing wasn't oversensitivity. It was accurate. The physical toll had been building for weeks by then, in ways I'd been explaining away as work stress or bad sleep or too much coffee. My appetite thinned out without my noticing, dinner sitting untouched on the counter more nights than not. My hands developed a small, persistent restlessness, tapping against my thigh in meetings, unable to stay still during phone calls. Twice that week, standing at my own front door before heading into another family obligation, I felt my heart doing something too fast and too loud in the quiet of the hallway, a physical announcement of a decision I hadn't consciously made yet but that some older, more honest part of me had already reached. If you've ever been the person everyone counts on but no one accounts for, stay with me. Because what I found next changed everything. 3 weeks before the Hawaii trip was scheduled to leave, Nathan called with news that would, unknowingly, hand me the exact stage I needed. A local arts journalist had picked up 2 of my pieces for a feature story, and the gallery wanted to host a proper opening, 30 guests, press coverage, The kind of event that would formally launch my work into a wider audience than the quiet 3-year build I'd managed on my own. You should invite people, Nathan said. Family, if you want them there. I thought about it for a long moment. Then I made a decision that surprised even me. I invited my mother, my father, and Brooke, along with the small circle of friends and colleagues who actually knew about my work. Part of me wanted them there for reasons I wasn't proud of. Not celebration. Witness. My mother RSVP'd yes almost immediately, with an enthusiasm that struck me, now that I knew what I knew, as almost grotesque in its ease. We wouldn't miss it, she wrote. So proud of you, sweetheart. I read that message 3 times, the same way I'd read her email about me being free help 3 times, and I felt something settle into place, not forgiveness, not yet, but clarity. She could hold both of those truths in her hands at once, apparently, without any friction between them at all. Pride when it was convenient. Dismissal when it wasn't. I understood, finally, that this wasn't contradiction. It was consistency. It had simply taken me 32 years to see the pattern clearly enough to name it. That night, I almost told Brooke everything. She called to ask, casually, whether I could watch the kids one more weekend before the Hawaii trip, and something in me nearly broke open right there on the phone, nearly told her I knew, nearly read her own words about being relieved not to deal with all of us back to her before she'd finished asking her favor. I didn't. I told her I had a work commitment that weekend, a small, deliberate lie, the first one I'd told my family in years. And I let her believe it was about spreadsheets instead of about the fact that I was no longer willing to be handed off like an appliance whenever it was convenient. Staying silent cost me something in that moment. It meant letting her keep thinking of me as reliable, unbothered Natalie for a few more weeks, when the truth would have ended that illusion immediately. It meant absorbing one more small, casual request without pushing back, purely so that when the moment came, it would land exactly where I wanted it to land, and not a day sooner. I'm not entirely proud of that choice. I understand it, though, in a way I didn't understand much of anything that summer. The gallery on opening night smelled like fresh paint and coffee from the small bar Nathan had set up near the door, and the light, warm, deliberately soft, angled to flatter the prints without competing with them, felt like the first room in years that had been built specifically to make me feel like I belonged in it. My mother arrived in a pale blue dress, already scanning the room the way she did at every event, cataloging who else was there and how it reflected on her. My father trailed behind her, checking his watch twice within the first 5 minutes. Brooke came separately, later, without Craig, apologizing for being rushed because of the baby. For the first hour, it was almost pleasant. My mother complimented the lighting. My father asked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, a real question about my process, how I chose which images to print large, which small. I let myself, briefly, enjoy it, the same old hope flickering that maybe this could be simple, that maybe pride could be uncomplicated for once. Then my mother found the piece hanging near the back wall, a black and white print I'd titled, simply, Logistics, an image of a single chair set apart from a long dinner table, empty, lit differently than the rest of the frame. This one's interesting, she said, studying it with the polite, appraising look she gave everything. What's the story behind it? I had planned this moment for 3 weeks. I hadn't planned exactly how it would feel to actually stand in it. It's about being invited to things, I said, and finding out later you were never really wanted there at all. She laughed, the small, dismissive laugh she used when she sensed a conversation moving somewhere she didn't like. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? I read your email, I said. The one to Brooke. About the Hawaii trip. The room didn't go silent, 30 other conversations continued around us, unaware, but the small circle around my mother, Brooke, and my father tightened into its own private stillness. What email? My mother said, too quickly. I took my phone from my pocket, opened the screenshot I'd been carrying for 3 weeks, and held it up, not thrust at her, not weaponized, just present, visible, undeniable. It's free help, and it keeps her useful. I said less than I'd rehearsed saying. I let the words on the screen do what 32 years of conversation never had. My mother's face did something complicated, a flush rising fast, her mouth opening on a denial before she'd even fully processed what she was denying. That's taken completely out of context. We were joking, Natalie. You know how texts read wrong sometimes. $8,400, I said quietly, and watched her blink, not understanding yet. That's what I made on my first gallery sale last fall. 15 pieces, 3 years of work you never asked a single question about, because you'd already decided what I was for. Free help. Useful. That's the whole email, word for word. Brooke had gone very pale beside her. Mom, she said, you told me to write that. I never should have agreed, but you're the one who. Don't, my mother snapped, turning on her, don't you dare turn this into something I did alone. And there it was, the collapse I'd been braced for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. My mother didn't apologize. She defended, deflected, and then, when neither of those worked in a room full of witnesses who'd gone quiet enough now to notice, she reached for the oldest tool in her collection. After everything we've done for you, she said, her voice rising, this is what you do, humiliate me at your own event, in front of strangers? I didn't humiliate you, I said. I just stopped protecting you from something you wrote yourself. Nathan, standing near the bar, had gone very still, watching. Aunt Diane, who I hadn't realized had arrived until that exact moment, stepped forward from the edge of the small crowd and stood beside me, not saying anything, just present, her shoulder nearly touching mine. My mother saw it. I watched something in her face register that Diane's silence, this time, wasn't neutral. It was a choice. My father hadn't spoken at all. He stood a few feet back, hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, and I understood, watching him, that his silence tonight was the same silence he'd offered my entire childhood, not cruelty exactly, just an absence dressed up as peacekeeping. A lifetime of letting my mother's decisions stand unchallenged because challenging them cost more than he'd ever been willing to pay. The journalist covering the opening, a young woman named Julia's colleague, notebook still in hand from an earlier interview, had gone quiet too, watching the scene with the specific attention of someone recognizing a better story than the one she'd come to write. My mother's breakdown, when it came, arrived not in that room but 2 days later, in a phone call I almost didn't answer. I need to explain something, she said, when I finally picked up, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I need you to actually hear me, just once. I stayed quiet, and she talked. When I was your age, she said, my own mother made it very clear which of her daughters mattered more. I was the one who mattered less, quieter, less pretty, the one who did the work and got thanked in the same tired way you've probably felt your whole life. I told myself I would never do that to my own kids. And then Brooke was born, and she was so easy to love out loud, easy to be proud of in front of other people, and you came along quieter, more capable, and I did to you exactly what my mother did to me, without ever once admitting to myself that's what was happening. I told myself I was just being practical. That you didn't need the same reassurance Brooke did because you were stronger, more independent. I made that story so many times I actually started believing it. The email, I want to tell you it was a one-time lapse, but it wasn't. That's just the one time I got caught writing down what I'd been thinking for years. I looked at you and saw someone useful before I ever let myself see someone who needed things from me too. I don't know when that started exactly. I think it might have started before you can even remember, and by the time you were old enough to notice, it just felt normal to both of us, you asking for nothing, me giving you nothing, and calling that closeness because it was easier than calling it what it actually was. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't know what I was doing when I left you off that trip. I knew. I told myself you wouldn't want to come anyway, the same way I've told myself 100 things over the years to make my choices feel smaller than they were. Seeing that photograph of the empty chair, I understood exactly what you meant by it before you ever explained it to me, and I hated that you were right more than I've hated almost anything in my life. I don't know how to fix 32 years in one phone call. I don't think I get to ask you to try. I just needed you to hear, once, that I know exactly what I did, and I'm not going to pretend anymore that I didn't. I didn't say much when she finished. I told her I hurt her. I told her I needed time. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't yet anything with a name I was ready to give it. Brooke called a week later, her voice thinner than usual, the particular exhaustion of new motherhood audible underneath everything else she was trying to say. I've been thinking about the email, she said. About what I wrote back. I told myself it was just a joke, the way I've told myself a lot of things were just jokes when it came to how we treated you. I don't have a good excuse. I was going to lose free childcare and I did the math before I did the right thing, and I'm not proud of that. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I didn't tell her it fixed anything, because it didn't, not entirely. What it did was open a door that hadn't existed before, narrow, conditional, but real. We talk now, occasionally. She sends photos of Tyler and Ava and baby Grace. I've started watching the kids again sometimes, but only when she asks directly, only when it's framed as a request instead of an assumption, and only ever on my terms now instead of by default. The dynamic with childcare shifted permanently after that spring. Brooke and Craig hired a part-time sitter within 2 months, a fact Diane told me with something close to satisfaction, because the unpaid safety net my family had built out of my time simply stopped being available once I stopped offering it silently. My mother and I speak rarely, and carefully, the way you speak to someone you're still deciding whether to trust again. She has not asked me to watch her grandchildren since that spring. I don't know if that's guilt or simple recalibration. I've stopped needing to know which one it is. My father called once, in October, and said almost nothing of substance, just that he'd seen an article about my exhibition and was proud, in the small, understated way that had always been the ceiling of what he offered. It wasn't enough to undo 30 years of quiet absence. It was, at least, something he chose to say out loud, which he hadn't done before. I still have the photograph, logistics, hanging in my own apartment now, the one my mother saw first at that gallery opening. Nathan sold 4 more prints of it in the weeks after the story ran in the local arts section, the piece having taken on a resonance neither of us fully anticipated when I made it. I think, sometimes, about the version of that gallery night where I said nothing at all, where I let my mother compliment the lighting and my father ask his careful questions and let the evening close on something easy instead of something true. I understand why I didn't choose that version. I don't fully regret the one I chose either. I only know that choosing truth over ease cost me a version of that night where nobody's face changed, and some nights, I still feel the absence of that easier evening, even knowing it would have cost me something larger in the years ahead. I left my accounting job 8 months later, not dramatically, not as a statement, just because the photography work had grown enough by then to stand on its own. I live in Carmel now, in a small house with better light than I ever had in Springfield, close enough to the coast that I can hear it some mornings if the windows are open. If you've ever had to choose between being needed and being seen, you already know there's no clean answer waiting at the end of that choice. There's only the quiet, complicated relief of finally choosing yourself, without needing anyone else's math to agree with you first. What appeared to be a story about a family vacation was never really about Hawaii at all. It was about the specific arithmetic families use to decide who gets protected and who gets used, an arithmetic so old and so quiet that everyone involved had stopped noticing they were still running the numbers. Carol's contradiction sits at the center of everything, a woman capable of writing "so proud of you, sweetheart" and "it's free help," and it keeps her useful about the same daughter within the same season, without apparent friction between the two. That isn't hypocrisy in the dramatic sense. It's compartmentalization built over decades, the kind that lets a person believe 2 incompatible things about someone simultaneously because examining the contradiction would require examining herself. The story's real turning point wasn't the discovery of the email, that was simply confirmation of something Natalie had been quietly gathering evidence for her whole life without calling it evidence. The actual turning point was smaller and stranger, the moment she chose not to text her mother that the laptop had been left open. That small, deliberate silence marked the first time in the story Natalie chose strategy over instinctive accommodation, and everything that followed grew out of that single reversal. Brooke's arc offers its own quieter lesson about complicity. She wasn't the architect of Natalie's exclusion, she was the willing participant, the one who found it easier to agree than to push back, and her confession afterward reveals something true about how families sustain unfair patterns, not usually through one cruel decision-maker, but through a chain of people finding it easier to go along than to be the one who says something. The deepest cost in this story was never financial, despite the numbers that anchor it, the $8,400, the 15 pieces, the years of unpaid labor disguised as closeness. The real cost was 32 years of a woman organizing her entire sense of worth around usefulness, because usefulness was the only currency her family had ever paid her in. Recognizing that pattern doesn't undo the years it took to build. It only marks the point after which she stopped being willing to keep paying into it. What lingers longest isn't the confrontation itself, dramatic as it was, but the quieter aftermath. The way real change in families rarely arrives as reconciliation and more often arrives as recalibration, a narrower but more honest relationship replacing a wider but dishonest one. That's a harder outcome to feel good about than a clean redemption arc, but it's very often the truer one. That's the story as it happened to Natalie. What it leaves behind is a question worth sitting with a little longer. I keep thinking about how long Natalie carried that empty chair feeling before she ever had proof it was real, how many years she spent wondering if she was imagining an unfairness that everyone else seemed to accept as normal. That's the part of this story that stays with me most, the specific loneliness of sensing something true long before you have the words, or the evidence, to defend it out loud. Maybe you know that feeling too. Maybe there's someone in your life you've quietly done the math on, the way Natalie eventually did, someone whose warmth toward you always seemed to arrive with conditions attached, even when you couldn't quite name what those conditions were. If there's a person who made you feel useful instead of loved, or a moment you brushed off that you can name clearly now, I'd love to hear it. Just leave one word in the comments. You don't need to explain it. Sometimes naming it is the whole point. Thank you for staying with Natalie's story all the way to the end. I hope wherever your own empty chair has been, you found a way to finally take up the space you were always owed.